everybody. Welcome to this issue of Staffing Monthly, where we're taking a deeper dive into sales. As you know, the economy is a little bit weird right now, and the market has shifted. There's still a lot of demand for labor. There's still a labor shortage, right? There's still, seemingly 10 million more jobs than there are people. So we're in a favorable supply and demand standpoint. However, there's a lot of reluctancy from employers, from potential clients about bringing people on. So even though there's a higher demand than supply for people, there's a greater reluctance, which means if you're going to be selling to either expand your market share, go into new markets, pick up, kind of grow your business, pick up new clients, whatever it might be, it's going to be more challenging than it has been over the last decade, right? And if you're a salesperson that's been in this industry selling for over a decade, you probably remember what it was like, kind of selling through the Great Recession and coming out of it. Maybe even that short blip during the pandemic of how hard it was to sell and find companies, right? Like it's challenging. We're moving into that season, and the smart companies are investing in sales training and getting their team brought up because they understand how hard it is going to be to sell. And what we want to do with this issue of Staffing Monthly is just give you a few techniques to kind of help better position your company to sell and grow and be successful during these challenging times until we get through the other side. So you've obviously heard from some of the other people in this issue talking about things like sales planning and things like how to actually be better prepared in that regard. What I want to share with you today is actually around the realm of negotiation, right? Because that's an area where it's going to happen more. When you're dealing with prospects, they are going to push back harder, and you're going to have to sell harder based on value, which we'll get into in a follow-on series. But that process of selling is going to be rooted in negotiation, right? How do you actually move buyers off their price points? And that's what we're going to talk about today, is that fundamental piece. Why do buyers have set their price points where they do? Why do they think our services are valued at what they are? We're going to talk through that because that's the foundational understanding that you need as a successful salesperson in order to be able to effectively negotiate and to be able to effectively sell based on value, right? So let's jump right into this here. So as I mentioned, we're talking about negotiation today. I'm Dan Mori, and if you don't know me, a little bit about me, I've been in this industry for over a decade and a half, and I have been an operator. I also publish the magazine Staffing Monthly, which is this digital publication that is geared towards providing knowledge and actionable insights to help you grow your agency. I also run Staffing Mastery, which is a executive coaching platform where we actually teach agencies systems to better grow their revenue. And I'm also the leader of the National Independent Staffing Association, where we try to provide an amazing network for independent owners in the United States and give them opportunities to learn, capture that knowledge, to take back to their organizations to help get better and hit their goals. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to get through some of this, and then the rest of it is going to be in the part 2 or follow-on series. We're going to talk about why we negotiate, right? A lot of people think negotiation is just a game that people play, but there's actually some psychological tendencies that are rooted in the actual why that we're going to dig into. And I'm going to frame out for you why each side approaches negotiations like they do and what you can do to kind of tip the balance in your favor, right? We will talk a little bit about how to navigate negotiations, and then we'll save the brunt of the tactical stuff for the next session. So why do we negotiate? Think about this. Think about when you buy something of significant value. Typically, if you go to a grocery store, you're not going to negotiate or haggle with the clerk over the price of bread or milk or cereal, right? You're not going to, kind of negotiate on those commodity type things, which is sort of interesting because staffing has sort of been commoditized, yet there's a lot of negotiation that goes on. So think about the times in your own life when you negotiate. These are things when you're buying a house. There might be a house that you want and you put in a lower price. That's a form of negotiation. A car, you might go there and an MSRP might be one number and you might say, I don't pay MSRP, I'm going to do this. That's negotiation, right? Jewelry, furniture, these are all things that most people typically don't pay list price for. So, but there's a reason why we negotiate as humans, and ultimately it comes down to this right here. All people Everybody negotiates because they don't fully appreciate or understand the value of what they're buying or selling, right? So all people negotiate because they don't fully appreciate or understand the value of what they're buying or selling. What does this mean? If you're buying a house and you're like, hey, this house is listed at X price, and you're like, I'm going to offer you something lower than X, right? There might be something about the house that's not quite on your dream list, right? Maybe it doesn't have the extra bedroom for a home office, or maybe it doesn't have a pool, or maybe it's a little bit too far of a commute from work, right? All these things that might make it less valuable to us. So, we're like, this is not quite as valuable. Or on the flip side, you might say, hey, I just want to offer full price because it has all of those things. It's anchored in some type of value, right? Now, on the other side of it, a car, same thing. You might just haggle because you've heard that no one pays MSRP and you don't want to get taken advantage of. So you're just going to kind of haggle and get the best price that you think you can get based on whenever the resistance or reluctance from the salesperson, becomes the stiffest, right? So, but generally speaking, when you're in negotiation situations, especially when it comes in staffing sales, it's because neither side fully understands or appreciates the value of what's being sold, right? And so I want to ask that question, like, do you know what you're actually selling when you're selling staffing services? And I give this session a lot. I talk about this topic quite often in training and coaching with a lot of different agencies. And I will tell you that the most common answers that I hear is excellent service. We've got the best service, or 24/7 access, or we've got amazing recruiting services, or we've got the best software, or the best tech stack, or we've got access to all of these resources, or we're locally owned, or we're a big national company. That's what we think that we're selling, but the reality is that's not what our buyers are buying from us. Okay. And if I flip the question and say, what do people buy from us? I generally will get the same answers. And that right there tells you that there's a gap between the understanding of between what buyers are buying and what sellers think that they're selling. And unfortunately, it's really all wrong. What buyers are buying from us is not the staffing services themselves. It's what the people we're placing on assignment, on contract, on permanent hire. It's what our people do for the buyer's organization, right? So they're not basically buying what we do. They're buying what we do does for them. Okay. So if you're talking about a warehouse customer and they say, hey, I need 20 material handlers to move product out of this warehouse, right? You think that you're selling them 20 people, but what you're really selling them is the work product of 20 people and what that work product does for that person. So if each material handler can move $100,000 of product out of the warehouse a day, now you have 20 people each moving $100,000 worth of product out of there. So now you're talking about $2 million of revenue to that business every single day that your material handlers are in that facility, right? Doing their job the right way. So when you think about the upside of that much revenue that your people are producing for your client, if you start comparing what you're charging your client against that outcome, you might think about the value differently, right? And I'm willing to bet most salespeople don't think about it like that. And most buyers also don't think about it like that. So I want to talk about this. So because buyers don't look at it like that, buyers tend to negotiate down because they don't understand the value of the staffing service, right? They don't understand that if you have 20 material handlers show up, it's going to be worth $2 million a day to the organization, right? They don't get that because they're not thinking about it like that. They're thinking, hey, my boss is telling me we don't have enough people, so I've got to get people. And then typically the charge is like, we need to get it for saving money as cheap as possible, right? They're not thinking about the quality of the work that can be done and the importance of that quality, right? So they anchor it sort of in the wrong thing. And what they're anchoring it to is the pricing that's set by other agencies, okay? So I want to do my best to kind of share what this vicious cycle looks like. So think about this. If you have a lot of untrained salespeople out there that don't really understand or appreciate the value of what they're selling and what that does for their client companies, they're going to need something to differentiate them. They're going to need something to get the client to pick them because they don't know how to sell based on value, right? Because they're untrained, right? So what happens then is they start offering lower prices because that becomes their differentiator. That's the quickest, easiest differentiator to give to your prospect. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth in a second. But when that happens, now those are all the price points or the proposals that are we given to a client. What is a prospect or a buyer or a client supposed to think the pricing of staffing services should be if everyone is saying, hey, it should be within this range, right? If you get 10 agencies and they're like, hey, this one should be 38%, this should be 42, this should be 40, 41, 39, and you give them all sort of in that range, there's no wonder that the buyer might think that staffing services are only worth maybe a 40% markup, right? So now they're anchoring it to that. And unfortunately for you, that's trying to be trained and you're trying to sell a better quality staffing service, right? That is disassociated and it's irrelevant to the quality of what you're providing and the value of what you're providing, right? So, but this is what this looks like in a consumer model. If you were to look at this screen right here, and if I was to say, hey, how much should a gallon of milk cost? And let's assume that all of these gallons of milk are exactly the same, right? So let's just assume that. And if I said, hey, how much should a gallon of milk cost? What do you think most people say? $3.50, right? And that's how it works. And every time I ask this question, like, yeah, they think it should be $3.50. And when they see that $5 one in the bottom middle, like they think that's just an outlier. And they're like, there must be, something different about that one. I'm not going to pay $5 when I can get the same milk for $3.50. That's logical, right? If all of this milk is exactly the same, there is no reasonable reason to pay more for a gallon of milk, right? That makes sense. Those are market principles. And your buyers, your prospects that you're dealing, they look at it this way. And if there's 5 staffing agencies out there and they're all saying the price point is around 40%, and then you come in and you're like, we're at 50%, and you don't seem any different to them, they're just going to think that you're that $5 gallon of milk, and they're going to think they're overpaying for your services, right? And this becomes essentially your mistake because you're not doing enough to differentiate yourself. You're letting price be the only differentiator between you and what all of the other untrained salespeople are doing out there. Now, I promise you this, if I was to put all of this out there in a supermarket and this all look the same, there will be people that buy that $5 gallon of milk. Okay. And I'm going to get into some of the reasons later, but you don't have to rely on what the market is telling you, what your competition is setting for prices to get the price that you want, right? Don't let your competition determine your prices. That's just it's not a healthy way to do business. So if that's the case, why do salespeople let this happen, right? If we know that we don't have to let our competition determine what prices, why are salespeople reluctant to negotiate up? And the answer is the same. It's because they don't understand the value of staffing services. And there's actually two things that they don't understand the value of. Most salespeople that you talk to don't truly understand the long-term value of a client, right? They don't. And there's a specific reason I'm going to get into in a second about why this is the case, about why the value is misplaced and it causes the sales behavior to go in a different direction. But they also are not trained on the long-term value that your services provide to the client. They're not taught that your 20 material handlers are producing $2 million a day of revenue for your clients, right? So because it's disassociated, they don't have a real value number to anchor their pricing to. So they anchor it to the market and they get this market data based on what the buyer's telling them. And the buyer typically will just notch down a couple points from what all of the other competitors are telling them, right? And this is that vicious cycle. So when we're thinking about this, salespeople, as I mentioned, they're putting the value on something else, not on the value of the long-term value of the client, or not on the value that our clients get from our services. They are placing the value on getting the client, right? Because in the day-to-day, most salespeople are measured based on how many clients they get, how many contracts they get. And sure, there's usually a component of margin or revenue or whatever. It says, hey, you booked this much business. But there's always a metric like how many meetings, how many proposals, how many contracts, all this stuff. And all that stuff is really important. I'm not knocking that, but because that becomes the day-to-day operator of the emphasis, the salespeople place the value on getting the client, right? So that being said, that's where their value is placed. Their objective is to get the client. So then they're going to anchor their value to what the prospect tells them the price needs to be. And they're just going to hope that the prices line up so they can easily get the client and, put a mark on the big board, right? So now when this happens and you've got these two people, the buyer and the seller, and they're coming in from the side, this is what it results in: negotiation. because now both sides perceive value is not anchored to the actual value of staffing. For the buyer, because they don't fully understand and appreciate the value of staffing services, they anchor it to what all of your untrained competitors are telling them. And then the salesperson, because they're sort of measured on how many clients they get, right? They sort of just anchor the value based on what the buyer is telling them that the price should be. And that information is contrived by the untrained salespeople of your competitors, right? And all of that is completely irrelevant. It is anchored on the wrong thing, right? Like that's just it. Like you wouldn't buy a car based on like how bright the red is on the paint job, right? Like that just doesn't make sense, right? This doesn't relate to the value of the vehicle. So what I want to talk about is, because we go into this and we don't really understand the value of this, what happens is we have these 3 price points on each side. So a buyer is going to go in and there's actually 3 price points that they have in their mind. Some are sophisticated buyers and it's mapped out, right? On the sales side, they've got these 3 price points, and some are sophisticated and it's like, here's your lowest, your highest, all this stuff. And we'll walk through specific examples here, but this is what it looks like. On the buyer side, they have their target, what they want to pay, right? And this ultimately becomes around the floor, right? This is the lowest point, what they want to pay. This is your floor. Then there's what they're willing to pay. They're like, if I can't get this, I'd be willing to go to this. And this willing, meaning that that's not the most they're willing to go, but like that's sort of like the willing to pay without putting up a big fight. And then there's the won't go above. Like if they really needed it and it could definitely check all the boxes, like they would pay up into a certain level, right? Top of the budget. And from my experience, most buyers, most organizations don't have a defined budget for staffing services because there's a lot of variability within it, right? So buyers have these kind of 3 price points, and a lot of times it's anchored in what the competitors' rates are, right? So I'm going to put numbers this in a second, but on the sales side, it's flipped. There's the won't go below, right? Like we have a floor too. This is the walkaway rate. This is the rate that leadership determines is like business below this point does not make sense, right? Do not take business below this markup. And then you have the willing to accept. Hey, I'd like to get higher. I have my target rate. That's what I want to go for. And that tends to be the ceiling, right? But there's like, hey, I'm willing to accept this number that's somewhere in between the ceiling and the floor. And that's how this works. Now, if we to look at kind of a fairly realistic example, you might see something like this out there in the staffing industry. You might have a buyer that says, I want to pay 40%. And the reason they might want to pay 40% is because all of the competition is telling them that the market's maybe around 42. And they just want to be savvy. They want to be a good buyer. They want to get a good deal. So like, I want to pay 40%. And they're going to tell you that everyone's offering them 40%, whether they are or not. The market could be at 42 and they're going to tell you that everyone's charging 40 because they want to use that as leverage to get 40, right? But they're sort of willing to pay 48. And the reason that they're probably willing to pay 48 is because their highest current supplier, or maybe the highest proposal that they've seen, has come in somewhere around 48, right? And that's where this number is typically coming from. They're usually not saying, hey, 40% of our labor force on top of this is going to be this much spend. And as it relates to the revenue, this is what the ROI would be. Most buyers, there are some that are very sophisticated and they absolutely operate like that, right? But the vast majority of buyers out there are not thinking like that. Their pricing is anchored to that of the competition that's being provided. And then they have their won't go above. And this number is usually just a little bit above the willing to pay. And it's just that comfort zone, like the margin of error. Like, hey, if I'm willing to pay 48, maybe I'd go a little bit higher than that, right? Maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room, but not much, 2 points, that's it. And on the other side, we might say, hey, we want to get this business for 55%. That's what our target rate is. If we wanted, this is what's going to help us hit our gross margin per hour numbers, all of that stuff. But we're willing to accept 45, right? And we won't go below 40. 40 is just the walk away. Anything less than 40 is just not worth it, right? And I'll tell you, there's a couple of traps that are getting set up in here, and you can they're pretty obvious, especially if a salesperson is focused on getting a client and the buyer comes in and says, hey, listen, 40, if you can't do 40%, no point in us talking. If you have a salesperson that has the authority to authorize that 40%, they might just take the 40% because they don't understand the value of clients to business. And they certainly don't understand that the supply and demand economics, right? Like we don't have to give our labor away for the floor, right? We just don't. Like labor is at a premium right now. And the more that we give it away at the floor pricing devalues the value of labor. And we shouldn't be doing that, right? But in that situation, you might have a salesperson that's untrained or not willing to fight for the business and doesn't really understand the value of it. And they're like, yeah, I got a client, boom. And they could have seriously left 8-10 points on the board, right? But they're not trained in that, so they don't really know what they're leaving on the table. They're just trying to get a client. So because of that, what tends to happen, the most common scenario is a buyer will say, hey, all of my current suppliers are at 40%. So that's what you have to be at. And the salesperson, knowing that that's their floor, they might say, well, do you have any wiggle room? Is there any flexibility at all? Because like 40% is pretty low. And this is their first pushback, right? And for most salespeople, it's their only pushback. So what happens is the buyer says, yeah, I've got a little bit of room. I can maybe go up a couple points, but that's it. Salesperson takes them to 42, right in between what they won't go below and what they're willing to accept. And they're like, hey, I got it at 42. That's not the floor. I look like a hero. The buyer wanted 40. So I'm going to tell my boss that they came in and they said, if I couldn't do 40, I couldn't get the business. And I got them to come up 2 points, make me look like a hero, right? Sales managers out there, am I telling a familiar story, right? This happens. So, but the problem is that's where it tends to stop, right? It tends to stop right there. And we get a lot of business that ends up being, many points below what the buyer's willing to pay and what they won't go above. So we're leaving money on the table because we're taking the path of least resistance, because we might only, if we avoid the first trap of just saying, oh yeah, you can do 40, I can do 40, let's just do this and beyond with it. If you get a salesperson that's willing to do one pushback, maybe you get a couple points. But the thing that I want to talk about is, how do we get to the upper zone? How do we go from here, maybe getting the business at 42, sort of in between your won't go below and willing to accept, and certainly they're between their want to pay and they're willing to pay, and get them to go between their willing to pay and won't go above? How do we move from here to here? And that's what I want to get into, is the psychology to do that. But before you can even move the prospect up into that upper zone, it is essential that you understand why your prospect values the services how they do, right? I'm telling you that from my experience, it's typically anchored in the market pricing, right? That's where it's anchored. However, that's not 100% of the time. And if you are going to be a prudent salesperson, you need to really take the time to understand, why do they value staffing services the way that they do? And this is going to be done through questioning. You're going to start to ask questions about why they need the service to be at 40, right? Is 40 a realistic number? Is that all that they can spend? Is that the only investment they can make to get the outcome? Is the labor and the product of that labor not worth more than 40%? Is there anything that would make your service more valuable, right? You have to start asking these questions, and through dialogue, conversation, and get to this. Otherwise, they're going to be like, no, it's 40% because everyone else is charging me 40%. So that just must be what the service is worth, right? They're just going to stick to that because that becomes their anchor. That becomes what their belief. And you have to sort of rewire their belief in this scenario in order to get them to move to this upper zone. So the only way that you can actually sell into that upper zone is to increase the perceived value of your service. That's it. You have to break the belief, and you have to show them that the service they're getting from their competitors may or may not be worth 40%, but regardless of that, that is irrelevant to the value of your service. So everything you have to do is you have to get the buyer away from comparing you to your competition, and you have to get them from anchoring your pricing to that of your competitor's market, right? And you do that through education. And this is where, I want to talk about this piece right here. Believe it or not, and in a different segment where I get into Excel sheets and numbers, I'm going to show this. And I've actually done this with my Reduce to the Ridiculous, and double bump talks that we've done. But here, it's not that big of a difference overall. To go from here to here and these 2 points, not that big of a difference in spend. So it's really not that hard for a salesperson to justify why they should go up here. But in order to do it, you have to cut their anchor from the market, and you have to get it to anchor to the value that you can provide. So, because when the buyer is anchoring the value to the rate of a cheaper competitor, you have to educate them why the cheaper offering is inferior, right? And, one of the quotes that I look at is to keep in a mindset, and I usually will maybe even say this to a prospect, is like, hey, a great business at a fair price is better than a fair business at a great price, right? And you get people like, yeah, maybe not long. And if you choose to use this or not and kind of setting your framing for your pricing, it's up to you. But either way, you should go into it thinking about this, because a great business is going to deliver great results. And if you can get great results at a fair price, meaning it's a reasonable value exchange between you and your buyer, that's better than getting fair, subpar, fair, business or results at a great price, because the savings you're going to get from that 40 to 50 typically is much less than the upward gain that you might get from better service and better quality, right? And that's where you need to educate them. You need to show them that your service will produce better results. I'm going to talk to you through a couple examples, and then we're going to get to a specific example about how we do this, right? So before we jump into specific staffing related examples, I want to show some consumer centric examples just to warm us up to the concepts of how these things happen to us in our everyday lives. So if I were to show you, if you're in the market for a car, right, you're shopping for a vehicle, and you were to go to a lot and you were to see these two cars sitting on the lot, car A, car B, and they are exactly the same. The only difference between these two vehicles is the VIN number, the vehicle identification number. That's it. Outside of that, everything else is identical, right? Same feature, same trim, same color, the whole nine. Everything is exactly the same. One car is $25,000. The other car is $15,000. Which car do you buy? I will tell you, I give this talk a lot. I train staffing organizations on this a lot. 99.9% of the people say car B. I say, well, why would you buy car B? What's wrong with car A? Nothing's wrong with car A. They're exactly the same. Why would I pay more for something that's exactly the same? I've got no good answer for that, because there isn't one. You should not, in your right mind, pay more for something that's exactly the same. And ultimately, the definition of paying more for something that's exactly the same is getting sold or getting taken advantage of, which is what most buyers are terribly afraid of. Nobody wants to get taken advantage of. No one wants to be sold. People love to buy, but nobody wants to be sold, right? We all have that fear of running into a savvy car salesman or a sleazy car salesman that's trying to take advantage of us and overcharge us for stuff, right? And we've seen the stereotypes. We've been in those situations, and these are the things, these are what buyers buy more than staffing services, right? Because we consume way more in our everyday average human lives than in our work as being a buyer. Unless you're a professional buyer, you work in procurement, right? But in that scenario right there, most people will say car B, right? So here, let's change it up. Let's make the price of the cars the exact same, but make the cars different. Now you have two cars that are priced exactly the same. They're exactly $25,000, but these cars are very different. Car A is a very practical Toyota Camry, maybe a Corolla, not really sure there. Looks like maybe more of a Corolla. Car B is a Ferrari, right? And if I say the same question, like, okay, now which car do we buy? Are we still buying car B? And this is where it gets interesting, because it's most people will still buy car B, but it's not 99%. It's typically like 80%. It's like, well, why are 20% of the people buying car A for the same exact price? Now it's based on the value. And when I start asking people for reasons, it's like, well, you can't fit a family of 4 or 5 in the Ferrari, right? And it's fun. I love doing this with a crowd, because you get this nice, healthy debate, and you're like, oh, the car A is going to get better gas mileage, and the insurance is cheaper, and the maintenance is cheaper, and all these things. And, you wouldn't want to drive it and hit a pothole, or all these crazy things that are valuable to people that operate the vehicle, because they look at it as a vehicle of utility, right? The biggest argument that people in the B camp have is, and there's two, there's the fun ones, like, hey, if I can get a Ferrari for $25,000, that's amazing, right? I would jump at that opportunity, right? I'm going to come back to that one in a second. But the biggest argument that the car B people make is, I would just buy the Ferrari and sell it for $250,000 and put $225,000 into my bank account, and then go buy car A, right? Makes sense. But why are they thinking like that? Because from a monetarily standpoint, car B has more value, right? And you absolutely could do that. You could buy that car, sell it for a whole lot more, kind of flip it, and then go buy car A. You could absolutely, because it's more value. So people are recognizing the value, so they're willing to pay the same price, but pick the thing that has more value, right? Now, let me come back to the ones that are like, oh, it's a fun car. It's amazing. If I can get a Ferrari for $25,000. I said, okay, let me ask you a question. If you really saw that somebody was selling this car for $25,000, what's the first thing that you would think? They said, oh my God, I can get a Ferrari for $25,000. I'm like, okay, that's fair. What's the second thing that you think? He goes, what's wrong with it? Why can I buy a Ferrari for $25,000? And now what's happening here, and this is human logic. We get emotional, but we kind of decide emotionally, but like we buy emotionally, but we decide or justify logically, right? People will come back to that logical point, like, why can I get something so valuable for $25,000? There must be something wrong with it, right? This deal must be too good to be true. What's that adage that we hear all the time? If it's too good to be true, it probably is, right? If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. That's what's going on here. So that happens in our business as well. Here, you start to shift this and it's like, hey, car A, car B. Now car B has a higher financial value. It costs more. Where would you do this? This doesn't actually change. There's still about 20% of the people that will buy car A because they're buying it purely for the utility. They don't care about sports cars. Nothing about that red Ferrari has any value to them whatsoever. And they're not interested in the upside financially where they can flip it. They just like, hey, I'm just going to buy a car. I use it to get back and forth to work, take my kids to soccer, whatever it might be. I'm sticking with car A. Now I feel better about it because it's $10,000 less than the other one. But the B people, they still have their same arguments. This car has more value financially. I can flip it. Or if I can get a Ferrari for that price, I'm going to do it all day long, right? And they almost will say, you know what? I'm willing to take the risk. There might be something wrong with that car, but it's such a low investment compared to the perceived value of it that I'm willing to take the risk on it, right? Because the value is anchored somewhere else. When I showed you the first scenario where the cars were exactly the same, now the only thing the market was basically anchoring the price. But here, the value and what someone's willing to pay becomes anchored on the value of the thing itself, not related to the other thing, right? People aren't making the decision to buy car A or car B based on what the other car is or how it's priced. They're doing it based on the specific value that that vehicle provides. Staffing is the same way. And I'm just showing you these examples to kind of warm your mind up to this is how people think and this is how we rationalize decisions. But now, let's go with this. 2 pens. Pen A, $2. Pen B, $1. And let's just, for sake of argument, assume that these pens are exactly the same. Which pen do you buy? Again, 99% of the people say pen B, right? Because if it's exactly the same, why pay more? Now, when you're selling your services, if you seem exactly the same, the buyer is going to say, why pay more? I should pay the same at most, right? And when you don't differentiate yourself in any meaningful way, the buyer has no choice but to use the price point as the deciding factor, right? Now, let me show another example. What if I told you the pen A was actually $2,000 and pen B was still $1? Which one do you buy? Again, when I ask this of audiences, 99% of people say pen B because it's cheaper, because these pens look the same. However, the question that I get is, why is pen A worth $2,000? You start to think about it, like, why is this $2,000? You might start to build up reasons in your own mind as why this might be a more valuable pen. Maybe it's not, maybe this is actually like platinum or something, or some rare metal, maybe it writes in pure gold, whatever, right? And you start coming up with reasons because the price point seems so unrealistic. You're like, wow, maybe that is valuable. Because another thing that human beings do is we sometimes we use the price of something to determine the value of something. So something that seemingly costs more seems to be more valuable, right? And there is a segment of buyers that typically like nicer things, and they assume that if something costs more, it is nicer and higher quality. But let me forget about that for a second. Let me break it down this way. What if I told you that the only difference between these two pens is ink color? What if I said pen A has black ink and pen B is blue ink? Is there anybody that's willing to pay $2,000 for a pen with black ink versus the one with blue ink? When I pose this question to the same audience, again, 99% of people, they're sticking with the blue ink pen B. And then I add another layer. I said, okay, well, what if I had the winning Powerball ticket that was worth $100 million and all you had to do was sign it with a wet black ink pen, wet signature, black ink, and it could be yours? Is there anybody in here that'd be willing to pay $2,000 for pen A at this point? 100% of people switch over there. And they're like, yeah, I would pay $2,000 for a black ink pen to sign that ticket if it meant I could get $100 million, right? And you see how that one the difference didn't do it for them. That no one cared about the ink at first. It was about what the ink could do for them. Does that make sense? So once you start to anchor the value of what you're charging to the output of what someone can get for it, it starts to change their thinking about what they're willing to pay for it. And that's the psychological shift that you need to move your buyers through, how to move them off of that pricing. So I'd be remiss if I didn't have a literal apples to apples comparison if we're talking about comparables in a talk. So here is this one right here. This is apples to apples. Apple A, $2. Apple B, $1. Which one are you buying? Again, when I pose this question, 99% of people will say, Apple B, right? They're exactly the same. If this is literally the proverbial apples to apples comparison, why pay twice as much for something? There's no good reason, right? However, and we've all seen this in grocery stores, as soon as we do this, as soon as I say, hey, this one is 100% organic and it's eco-friendly, and this one over here has probably been sprayed with harmful pesticides, and I say, now which apple are you going to buy? I didn't change the product. I didn't change the price. I just provided a little bit more information, a little context. And guess what? Everyone's saying Apple A. They're willing to pay twice as much. I know it might seem like an insignificant amount, going from $1 to $2, $1 more, but it's twice as much. They're willing to pay twice as much for the apple that is 100% organic and eco-friendly versus the one that might have been sprayed with harmful pesticides, right? And the reason why is now it's based on the value and the risk, right? They're no longer comparing it apples to apples. They're no longer saying, hey, these are two exact apples and one just costs more, so I'm going to pay the lesser price. Now they're like, well, okay, now I understand why this one costs more, so I'm willing to pay more, because now they understand their perceived value of the product is increased. So now they're willing to pay more, and they're not anchoring the price of that product against a similar product. They're anchoring against the value of that individual product. And this is how you need to move people through the buying cycle. Now, I also, I love this example because I think Starbucks does an amazing job at getting people to overpay for coffee, here we are even today. But I travel a lot. I go to conferences, I keynote speak, I coach companies all over the country, and I'm often in hotels, right? And in most hotels that I stay at, there's a Starbucks in the lobby. Now, this hotel also uses the same Starbucks coffee for their coffee machines in the room. So I literally could get a free cup of Starbucks coffee in the room, or I could leave my room, take the elevator all the way down the lobby, stand in the line of Starbucks, and go overpay for black coffee, right? So, but why do I do that? There's something about Starbucks that has convinced me they've anchored the value to that entire experience, even now, to make me willing to pay more for coffee than I could get for free. And I guarantee I'm not alone. I'm not the only person that does this, because there's usually 30 other people in line waiting at Starbucks. So, but let's make it about you. Obviously, if I asked you which of these two agencies that you would pick A, because you're biased. However, if you put yourself in the shoes of a buyer, a prospect, a potential client, and they're looking at staffing agency A and staffing agency B, and they look exactly the same, and they're both the same price, which one do you think they're going to pick? I will tell you this, most of the time, the decision factor becomes of how much they like the salesperson, right? And that's what it is. If everything looks the same, you're going to decide on which sales experience made you feel the best. And that's going to come down to who the salesperson is, right? And people buy from people they like, and people like them. So if your salesperson is super relatable, you might win this business more of the time. However, if all things are being equal, it literally is a 50-50 shot, right? That's what it's going to come down to. And frankly, I think business and the long-term value of clients is worth more than letting it fall down to a 50-50 shot. But this isn't what happens most often. What you're typically up against is this: your staffing agency at a higher price than your competitor. And if these two agencies look exactly the same to the buyer, now which one does the buyer pick? The lower price. Because it's human nature to tell ourselves, why pay more for something that's exactly the same? And how many times have you heard buyers say, What are you going to do for me? Why should I pick you? Right? Why should I pick you? You all have access to the same exact tools, the same exact candidates. Like, why should I pick you? Now, what's funny is when I heard that the very first time, way back when, 16, 17 years ago, and I did my first staffing sales pitch, and I went in there and I had the most amazing sales pitch. We're locally owned, and we got this, and great customer service, and all of this stuff, right? Amazing quality, all of this stuff. And then the buyer said, well, why should I pick you? And I'm like, this is awesome. He wants to hear my pitch again. And I went right back into it. And at the end of it, he's like, I understand all that. He goes, everybody is telling me the same exact thing. What I want to know is, why should I choose you then? And in that moment, I realized that I missed it. The reason that the prospect was asking me that question, why should I choose you, was not some savvy negotiation technique, not some mastermind objection. It's because I didn't do my job. He literally didn't know why he should pick me. He didn't know. I did not do my job. I did not do my job as a salesperson to differentiate my agency from the competition, right? So he was asking out of genuine sincerity, genuine curiosity, And at the end, after I pitched him again, he's like, I understand all of that. You said it the same both times. It's clearly practiced. I just don't understand why you're different than your competition, and why I should choose you over them. And I failed to differentiate myself, leaving my price to be the only differentiating matter. And I had to actually cut price in order to get the business. And that was a very expensive lesson at that point in time. So how do you do this? As I said before, you have to understand why they value the business the way that they do, right? You have to ask them, okay, you're currently paying 45%. I understand that. Or other agencies are telling you that they can do this for 45%. Why do you feel that this service is only worth 45%? Or what level of performance and quality are you currently getting? Can you share with me what the fill percentage rate is, or maybe conversion rates, or time to fill? What is your attendance rate? What is the conversion rate, the people that you're actually hiring on, the permanent headcount? Is there an accident rate if it's light industrial healthcare? What are these things? These are the levels. Interesting. Can I share with you what ours are? Our fill rate is 90%. Our attendance is 95%. Our conversion rate is 85%. 85% of people that we place get hired on by our clients. And we have a very low accident rate. Be happy to share with you our workers' compensation, records to show this. You start laying this out and you start comparing the value between the two. And then you can ask the legitimate question, would this level of quality and output be worth 5% more? Now you're giving them very reasonable, very logical talking points that they can start to justify why they might have to pay more, right? Then they might look at this and be like, holy cow, if you can get me filled 20% better, and let's just say that they always need 10 people and the competitor's only giving them 7. So their production is down by 3 headcount, and you could get them 9. And they're like, man, if I could have 2 other people on my floor at any given time versus what I'm getting from my competitors, like this is what our product would be, it would be worth paying 5% more all day long, right? And then you can start to get into some of those conversations, which I'm not going to delve into too much today, but in one of our future series, we're going to get into the actual questions that you can ask, but you can start to find out, like, what does this mean to you? Like, if we had more people here quicker, what would that do for your business? What is the desired outcome that you are looking to get out of your contingent labor program? Right? And they'll start telling you this. And if you show them how you can get them to where they want to go, then you can ask them, hey, it's clear to me that you're not where you want to be today, paying 45%. If I could get you closer or all the way to where you want to go through my services, would it be worth investing a little bit more? Now you're framing your price point against the desired outcome of where you can help the client go, not against the market, not anchoring it to the competition. You're anchoring it to the value that you can provide to the client, and it's going to be better aligned, and you're going to be better positioned to get a better client. So with this, in one of our future sessions, we're going to get into navigating negotiations. I'm going to walk you through some very specific, objections you might encounter or ways that negotiations occur and how you can navigate those. But I hope for today that you actually got a lot of value out of this session. and that you can take some of these frameworks or these concepts and start teaching your people the long-term value of clients to your organization, and start educating them to the value that our services provide to our clients, right? And if you're not quite sure on how to do that yourself, certainly reach out to me. I'd be happy to tell you some techniques about how you can get that information and then package that in a way to teach and train your people, But one of the best ways, ask your clients. You have great clients. There's people that love you. You have a great relationship with them. Go ask them. Say, hey, what is it that our workforce does for you? And why is that meaningful to your organization, right? And then you can start to take that information and weave it into the marketing language, the sales language, and start to actually sell based on value, which is going to help you support you in negotiations. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Please let me know some feedback. Shoot me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn, and let me know what you thought of it.